In case y'all hadn't noticed by looking at Charles, this week is Valentine's. It takes a brave man that's secure in themselves to dress like Charles. Hope everybody has a happy Valentine's and that you get candy and flowers and whatever. And so I think Valentine's a good holiday. That's the time when you don't have to prepare for 6 months for its coming and clean up for 6 weeks when it's over. So I hope you'll have that. We're delighted that you're visiting with us today. We're an odd lot, but we always seem to attract certain kinds of visitors. So we're glad you're here today. Oh, we're an odd lot, I can guarantee you that. But we're interesting and we're nice, and so we're glad you're here today. The left wing kind of outweighed the right wing over here. I think we've got, I think this flu scare has really gotten into people. So with schools being out, I hope people are just afraid of the flu and instead of having it. So we certainly will think about who's missing today and remember them in our prayers. I got one of my best compliments this week, so I'll share it with you, okay? I was in Fort Wayne, Indiana. I've been everywhere this week, but I was in Fort Wayne, Indiana, and that is an airplane kind of capital. And so somebody had recreated a 1912 flying machine that a man in Fort Wayne flew. They had hung this from the ceiling of the main area of their airport, and they had gotten period clothes in a department store. What do you call them? Mannequin, that's right. Thanks. It leaves you sometimes. And dressed them up and put them on the front of that plane. So I took a picture of it with my phone and I sent it to Meredith. I said, show this to Bradford. And I said, tell him that's me, Cap, driving the plane. And so Bradford was fascinated with that, and he looked at it for a minute and he said, that's not Cap flying that plane. Said, that's some other dummy. I just love that. And then later, I have the reputation in our family of falling a lot, running into stuff, making a lot of noise, not walking through an area but tromping through an area, et cetera, et cetera. And so Meredith said that she and Bradford were back in another part of their house this week, and something fell in the kitchen. A pot or a pan or something made a big racket. And said Bradford turned and looked up to her and says, Mama, is Cap here? They about got me covered on that, don't they, Billy? We're glad, Bill, about your trip. I bet that was very, very interesting. Y'all know who the Kardashians are, I bet, don't you? If you don't, you're out of touch. I would imagine there aren't a lot of Sunday school classes starting today with the Kardashians. Robert was a California lawyer, of course, and he was best friends with O.J. Simpson. And he was the person that assembled O.J.'s team. But he was also probably the person that knew exactly what O.J. had done. And as soon as that trial was all over, Robert Kardashian had nothing else to do with O.J. Simpson. His wife, Chris, after Robert died, married Bruce Jenner. You all remember Bruce Jenner. I'm sure that was an interesting relationship. And then they had a bunch of these kids, and the most famous one was probably a girl named Kim. And you getting all this, Bishop? And so Kim married this guy named Kanye West. And Kanye is a pretty famous Hollywood figure with records and movies and with all of that kind of stuff. And so they began to have children. And the first child that they had, they named North. Which that's kind of interesting. Why would you name a child that's got the last name West with the first name North. What's your name? Northwest. What's your brother's name? Southwest. But at any rate, had a second child, and they named that child Saint. I've yet to get that one figured out, although I don't spend a lot of time worried about the Kardashians. And then they have just had a child. They had this child by a surrogate. Another woman carried their child because Kim had gotten too big the last time they had a baby, and so they named this child Chicago. Now that's got to be interesting to have a child named Chicago. But sometimes naming becomes a very interesting proposition. I was in seminary with a boy whose last name was Rock, R-O-C-K. And for some weird reason, his maybe not thinking parents had called him Clay. And so everybody ran around calling him Clay Rock until he got just totally and completely upset by that. And so I'll never forget one week in every class that we had, and I assume in the other classes that he had, that he stood up and asked for a moment of the teacher's time, which the teacher gave him, and he said, I'm tired of all your all's jokes about Clay Rock. I do not want to be known any longer as Clay Rock. He said, from now on, I will be known as Clayton Andrew Rock. Thank you. And he sat down. We had one old boy from Etowah that was in that seminary, and he had a sense of humor that was about like you'd expect for somebody like Etowah. And so it wasn't a week until that boy would show up, Clayton Andrew Rock, and he would say, hey, Buick, come over here. Get it? Clayton C. Andrew A. Rock R. Car. So for the rest of that poor old boy's time in seminary, he was Buick. About 5 or 6 years ago at a conference, I saw that guy from Etowah, now we're all old, stand up and introduce Clayton Andrew Rock. It was all over the materials. That's Buick, and I'm not sure that anybody heard another thing he had to say. But naming is interesting. My wife and I have a woman that we have known for over 30 years that we have done a lot of stuff with, and has become just almost like a part of our family, literally. And she just knows everything, and she's got a big family, and she's all the time talking about her family. And so we were talking about our illustrious leader and his friend Stormy. You all picked up on that, I guess. And so she said, I just want to make one thing clear. She said, I've got 2 great nieces, and one of them's named Stormy. And she said, I'm just trying to tell everybody that knows me that that's not the same Stormy that we're hearing about on television all the time. And so she went on to explain that this girl, Stormy, her great niece, is a twin and has a twin sister. And that for some strange reason, that when these 2 girls were born, that the mother and father named one of them Stormy, and now she goes by Storm, and the other one Heavenly, and that now she goes by Heaven. And so Storm and Heaven are at all of the family reunions. And then this woman that my wife and I know said, you got to be really careful about the names that you give people, because maybe that'll have something to do with them turning out however they're going to be. And she said, boy, it really happened in this instance. Said, poor old Storm. Said she's been into every kind of trouble and stirred up every kind of mess imaginable. Little Heavenly's the sweetest thing that's ever been. What was happening there was very biblical, because the Bible places a lot of emphasis on naming. Anytime that someone's name, for example, gets changed in the Bible, Abram to Abraham, or Jacob to Israel, anytime those kinds of things happen, you realize that you're trying to do something more than just give a name to recognize somebody, but you're trying to in some way affect destiny with the name that is given. You're trying in some way to affect destiny with the name that is given. The best example that I've ever seen of that, and this is absolutely true, not that anything I would say is not, but this is, prior to Civil War, there were African Americans that migrated to the north, sometimes having to go on the Underground Railroad, sometimes finding other ways of getting there. And a large African American community settled in around Staten Island, right near New York City. They were free slaves legally, but they all times kind of had to deal with their own kinds of racism in that part of the country. And so this woman was trying to solve that and was trying to change that for her children. She had had too much of her life and her past life with slave names, and so she began to think about naming her in ways that would have no association with slave names. She had 2 daughters and a son. The first daughter she literally named Chattanooga. That's how I kind of was attracted to that, because the woman had grown up in Chattanooga, had had family in Chattanooga, had actually loved Chattanooga, liked to remember and think about Chattanooga, and so by naming her daughter Chattanooga, she would think about this place where we live. I kind of like that. The second daughter was named Copenhagen. And the reason for that was a little bit different. This woman liked to dip and chew, like a lot of our older ancestors kind of liked to dip and chew, and so she all the time kept herself an old green can of Copenhagen around somewhere, and so she named her second daughter Copenhagen. But then she had a son, and she knew how, even in the North, that young black men were sometimes racially treated as being inferior. And she said, in the world that we lived in Staten Island, a white person would never respect a black person enough to call them Mr. And so she named her boy Mr. So that anybody that referred to him or when his name went around, it had to be Mr. something or other. Names have a lot to do sometimes with destiny. When I was first teaching in Chattanooga, I had a counseling practice. I had a man come to me, and some of you may figure out who I'm talking about. His wife had died, and he was left with 3 boys. And I can tell you that he did a great job raising those 3 boys, or at times trying to raise those 3 boys. The oldest one grew up and got married, and he and his wife moved on down the road in their relationship, and they were getting ready to have a baby. And so one day this guy calls me up and he said, can you come over to my house? We're having some problems. And so I went over to his house, not knowing, of course, what the problems were going to be. And it was interesting how this whole thing that we're talking about relating to naming was what was on the table. First of all, the son that was married and his wife were having a little bit of a problem. They had found out that they were going to have a girl. And his mother was deceased, and so it made sense to him that this new girl would be named after her, and her name was Anna. And so he was insisting on Anna. The girl, just by coincidence, mother had also deceased. And she had thought forever that if she ever had a little girl, she would name the little girl after her daughter, after her mother, and her mother's name was Jean. And so you had this great big conversation going on. Would the girl's name be Anna, or would the girl's name be Jean? And they brought me in to kind of deal with that a little bit. I did just exactly what I believe most every one of you in this room are thinking about. I said, well, why don't you just call her Anna Jean? And I thought, well, hey, that's easy. We'll take care of that problem solved. The only problem was that still put Anna in a little bit of a higher position than Jean, and so that didn't go down too well. But I'll tell you what, by the grace of God or whatever, that problem got solved. I said, why don't you call her AJ? And although that left Anna in a higher position, for some reason that just had a ring of truth to them. And so there's a teenage girl out there in America somewhere today who is carrying the name AJ everywhere she goes. Thank you, Steve, for all your great counseling. I did that a lot in counseling. But the real problem was the boys. And the boys had become older teenagers. And they had finally gotten to the place where they could get out from under their father's eye a little bit, and they were beginning to get in trouble. They'd got to spend a few days home from their school here in town because of some of that trouble. And the father really wanted me to talk to them. And so we talked a little bit, and he said, you're not getting where I want you to go. And I said, well, what do you want me to talk to them about? And he said, I want you to talk to them about the Bible. And I said, well, what part of the Bible? And he said, I want you to talk to them about that part of the Bible that talks about a good name and how much a good name is worth. And he said, I want you to talk to them about that part of the Bible that says that the good name is more precious than all the riches or all the finery or all the jewelry in all of life. A good name is more precious than gold. And then he told those boys, he said, boys, he said, I've done everything that I know how to do in the way I've lived my life. And then he broke up a little bit and he said, your mama was the same way. We've done everything that we know how to do to try to give you a good name and to give our family a good name. And it's now becoming your responsibility, because of the choices that you make, to take our name and to take the name of our family into the world. He said, I know y'all are at a time in school when you're talking about what you want to do in life. One kid was brilliant and became an astrophysicist or something like that. The other kid was a great athlete and now has become a great coach where he lives. And he said, I know that people are talking to y'all about what you can do and what you want to amount to. He said, I'll be proud of you for anything you do. But he said, I'll be most proud of you if in addition to whatever you do, that you take the name of our family into this world in a way that brings honor, especially to your mother. And then he said, okay, Steve, that's what I want you to talk about. I said, I don't really have anything I can add to that. And those boys turned out unbelievably well. Good name is more precious than gold. I kind of was toying around with these thoughts, and I was studying some things in the Bible that you all know about. And I was kind of doing some preparation for Easter, and so I was looking at some of the Easter events. And all of us know that time when Pilate doesn't know what to do with Jesus. And Pilate is maybe trying to get Jesus off his hands, or maybe Pilate understands that Jesus is actually a good man, and he's trying to get maybe a way out for Jesus. You remember what happens. He went before the crowds of people that was accustomed to Passover, and he's going to free somebody. He's going to let the crowd decide who. And they throw Barabbas up there next to Jesus. Now you all know about Barabbas. You know that Barabbas was a man that the Romans hated because he was almost a terrorist against everything that the Romans did. He was an insurrectionist. He was all the time causing Rome problem. They were ready to get rid of him. But in addition to him being a real pain for the Romans, he was a real pain for the Jews. And so he didn't care about his fellow countrymen. He would just as soon have robbed or killed a fellow Jew as a Roman. He would just as soon have taken advantage of a Jew as quickly as he would of a Roman. And so this Jewish community hated Barabbas, and this Jewish community were afraid of Barabbas. And so I think in the back of his mind, Pilate knew that this crowd surely would let Barabbas be crucified and get rid of Jesus. But Pilate made a mistake. What I found out was that in that world, when a man like Pilate stood up and went through this kind of a process, there would be a sign made. And that sign would help you, especially if there was a crowd of people and it was an uproarious time and it was a tense situation and everybody was letting their feelings be known. And then I'm reading along there and I find out Barabbas was his name, but that wasn't his whole name. His whole name was Jesus Barabbas. Now, the only reason that we call him Barabbas is because one of the early church fathers, a guy named Origen, O-R-I-G-E-N, decided that that needed to be taken out of the ancient text and the early editions of the Bible that they had, because to call this terrible man Jesus Barabbas was to demean Jesus, the Son of God. But that was his name, Jesus Barabbas. So here's what I believe happened. I believe that Pilate got up there with Jesus at one side and Barabbas at the other. And Pilate held up a big sign that said, Jesus Barabbas, just so everybody would know, here's this horrible, awful criminal. And then in all likelihood, as kind of a way of mocking or maybe taking a little bit of the air out of the balloon, he holds up this other sign, Jesus, the King of the Jews. And I thought that was so ridiculous that surely to goodness the people would say, let's crucify this Jesus Barabbas. He didn't have a clue, though, the hatred and the disdain that the Jewish leaders at the front of the crowd, hollering the loudest, held for Jesus, the King of the Jews. And they say, crucify him. And in all likelihood, that's the same sign that was nailed to the cross above Jesus' head. But you know, last week I talked about this tree of life. I talked about how everybody that's ever lived has become a part of that tree of life, and that their spirit feeds that tree of life. I talked about how all of us at some point will become a part of that tree of life, and that our spirits will feed that. But I've kind of thought this week, that might not have been specific enough, or that might not have been good enough. How exactly do we enter this spirit of life? How do we exactly enter this tree of life that is going to have so much influence going forward on the world? Maybe the way that we enter it is with our names. Barabbas is in that tree of life. And all the Barabbas-like people that have ever lived are in that tree of life with their name. And Jesus is in that tree of life with his name and all that that signifies and all that that means and all the influence that it has. We're all going to enter that tree of life. And we're going to enter it with our names. And what that name carries forward with the kind of people that we've been and the kind of things that we've done and the kind of lives that we have lived. They'll be talking about your name, and they'll be talking about my name for a long time to come. And it's up to us to make sure that that name is a good name, more precious than gold. I hope that we'll leave enough stuff that our mates and our kids and our grandkids will be taken care of. That's important. I hope we'll leave enough stuff that some charitable cause out there that we contribute to will be aided by what we leave. That's important. But doesn't it make sense to hope that beyond any of that, that what we leave to that tree of life and the spirit that feeds it is the kind of name that we have constructed in our communities and our families and our churches and the people that care about us the most. When I was getting ready to be a teenager, being brought up in the First Baptist Church in Athens, I got saved. About everybody else did too. We had revivals. People getting ready to be teenagers were the prime focal point of those evangelists. They scared the living daylights out of us, so we get saved. So after we got saved in that church, we had to go to pre-baptism classes in which we learned about church membership. We had this young minister. You remember Joe Harding? He ultimately became a Methodist. So he's a smart guy, you see. And Joe Harding took that very, very seriously. It was not just a kind of a passing thing to do before you dunked the people in the baptismal pool. And so in one of our meetings, Joe Harding kind of had us circled around some chairs, and there were probably 20 of us in the room. And he said, I've come here today to ask you all a question. He said, I want to know why you came down to the front of that church to get saved. He said, I want to know why you came down there. One girl, honest to goodness, I can tell you her name, said, I did it to make my mama happy with me because we've got some stuff coming up and I've been begging her for a new dress, and I knew that if I got myself saved, she'd get me that new dress. Honest to goodness. And she got the new dress. But she answered the question. One boy said, and I won't mention any names, well, all the other kids in the class were doing it, so I thought I didn't want to be the only one that wasn't saved, and so that's why I came down. And that's why I came down. One boy who'd not gotten into much said, that guy came here to preach, scared me to death, and I didn't want to go to hell. That's why I came down. And one boy who had probably heard all the right cliches said, I wanted to get forgiveness for my sins. And old Joe Harding said, you're not old enough to have had that many sins. And so he said, none of you all have given me an adequate answer. And he said, I'll get in trouble with the deacons and your parents, but I'm not sure I'm ready to baptize any of you. You don't have a good reason for getting saved. And he said, I'm going to give you a good reason. And here's what that man said. He said, by coming down to the front of that church in your own lame ways, you were trying to say that you wanted to associate your life with the name of Jesus. And by coming down to the front of that church and now by being baptized, and I'll baptize you, you're saying to the world that I want to go out associated with the name of Jesus. And I want to say to everybody that my life and my actions and my thoughts will be as Jesus associated as they can be. And you know what? I think maybe in that moment I got saved, because in that moment I found something that I could utterly believe in and something that made total sense to me. That I wanted to be associated with the name of Jesus. And I wanted that association to drive my destiny and channel the actions of my life. And that made sense when I was 12 years old. And that made sense to me this morning when I was thinking about working through the last part of this lesson. That makes sense to me right now. I have found brilliance in Confucius. I have found brilliance in Lao Tzu. I have found brilliance in great rabbis. I have found brilliance in many of the teachings of Islam. But I want to be associated with the name of Jesus. And I want that association to be what carries my life into the future. And I want that association to be what distinguishes me in that big old tree of life that we're a part of. I hope that articulates maybe what you kind of believe too. That you wouldn't be here today, and you wouldn't be calling yourself a Christian today if you didn't somehow have the intent of your life and your good name being associated with the name of Jesus. Let us pray. Help us to know, Father, that our names are always going to be associated with something. And we're not trying to be the Kardashians, and we're not trying to be Clay Rock, and we're not trying to be Stormy and Heavenly. But we know our names are what carry us into the world. So help